Thank you for joining the webinar. Thank you especially for our presenters, our 4 presenters later. I'll just get a little introduction to why we are here and why we called you in. My name is Lars Klyver. I'm directing the Danish Board of Technology, and which is a member of the Human Brain Project. For a few of you who don't know the Human Brain Project, it's a flagship project. I think it is the largest project ever started by the European Commission. It's building an infrastructure for brain research and brain-inspired computing. And it is now going into its last phase as a project, but will then continue afterwards as an infrastructure. The reason we have this webinar is that one of the objectives being worked on by the Science, Ethics and Society group, but also in the wider HPP now, is to build a much wider community and also build up some sort of open research agenda setting function in the HPP. This is being explored now, and I and Aske, who arranged this webinar with you, are working on what we call an opinion for HPP, which is basically an overview of an issue which HPP should take up, and also what HPP could do on this issue. And this opinion will be delivered before the end of the year, we hope, or at least in the beginning of January. The whole idea is to have a much more inclusive infrastructure, a much wider community, and also an infrastructure which has a very strong focus on societal benefits of brain research, which also means that it has to be an infrastructure which listens to the needs that are out there in society. And that's, of course, where open research agenda setting comes in, to catch the expectation of society, to create also a wider collaborative environment in brain research and brain-inspired computing, but also to create, and therefore also to create relevance for a much wider cross-disciplinarity in brain research. The first presentation is by Carthage Smith, and Carthage we have met before. We have you have been the editor of a fine paper on open research agenda setting, made by OECD, among other things on basis of a workshop that you arranged in Korea, where I had the pleasure also to take part, and where we had an interesting overview of the quite big diversity of open research agenda activities all over the world. So we have invited you to give your view on where this is, how much it matters, and how it should matter, or whatever you want to say, because I know you have had a lot of considerations about this when making the paper and discussing with a lot of people. So basically, we have invited you to just hear what Carthage thinks of all this, and also what you have a thought of how it could be used in the HPP.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Lars. Thanks a lot for that introduction.
The floor is yours.
Is that okay? Yeah. So what I'll do in this presentation, in fact, is I'll just go through the study, the paper that we've published, that Lars was referring to, and then afterwards in the discussion we can talk about what it means for the Human Brain Project. I should say that obviously some of you are experts in this. I have no practice experience in research, open research agenda setting. So my observations are, if you like, from the outside, someone who's looked at a few different cases. So the work I'm going to present, it's certainly not just my own. There's a couple of people here from OECD, Julia and Di, who were very involved. Lars was also involved, and it was done jointly with a group from Korea at STEPI. Okay, right, so just to situate this, so from the OECD perspective, we've been doing quite a lot of work around open science. If you like, we see sort of three main pillars for open science. One is open access to publications, the other is open data, and the third is open to other stakeholders. So the engagement of other stakeholders, citizens and business and industry in the whole process of science. And that whole process starts with the agenda setting, but goes through to the end stages of the transition and the translation into use. And in the middle, we have citizens actually engaging in the science process. So there are various terms for various parts of this, from citizen science down through to the research agenda setting. And what I will talk about is research agenda setting. But it's important that all of these things are distinct and shouldn't be confused. And sometimes people just talk about citizen engagement and they mean all of these different processes. They're all quite distinct. They affect different parts of the science process, involve different methodologies, etc. So the work that we did was we looked at a small number of quite different cases. So these cases were at different scales, from national down to, in fact, from regional down to quite local. They involve different sectors, and the aim was to really look, were there generic issues, generic challenges that came up in these different cases, and potentially generic solutions. So looking at these diverse cases, what were the general messages we could pull out of this? The process was quite classic. We did some desktop work, had long interviews with the managers or the principal investigators in these different exercises, sometimes with more than one person to try and get a handle on how they were actually done. And then we had this workshop in Seal where we discussed the cases that Lars mentioned and ended up with a policy report. So the cases we looked at, they're listed here. I would say they varied from Cumulac, which is obviously the big European study, the Great New Zealand Science Project, which is national, the Dutch National Research Agenda Setting Project, and then a few more specific, more local projects from different parts of the world, Colombia, Japan, Korea. We also looked at the James Lind Alliance. I won't talk about Simulac and James Lind because obviously there are people who will talk about those afterwards. So I'll focus on the first five. These are some of the logos. This is actually not just to animate the slide, but the branding of these projects is important. You see, for example, the Great New Zealand Science Project. It's a kind of a friendly, easily accessible branding, and that's because it was actually a public outreach campaign. The others are more research organization focused, but the branding is important. So what did we actually look at in these interviews, in the work that we did on these cases? So what was the background? Where did they emerge from, and what was the context, sort of the political context driving these? What were they actually trying to achieve? Issues around who was involved and the governance. How was the project actually designed? What were the methodologies? We had a particular interest in the use of digital technologies. There's a sense that now in the new digital world, it should be much easier to engage multiple stakeholders. And that's partly true. We'll come back to that at the end. Issues around the challenges and what we could learn from them in actually implementing the project. And then was there any follow-up and assessment? And actually, in most of them, there's very little follow-up and assessment of impact. So starting with the Great New Zealand Science Project. So this was a big public outreach, public engagement project linked to the development of the 10-year science plan for New Zealand. So it was led from a ministry, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which looks after research. At the outset, they defined specific thematic areas. So it wasn't just an open consultation. They had certain areas defined fairly broadly. They're listed here from marine through to advanced materials. It was a large media and outreach campaign linked with a website where any member of the public or from different, if you like, more research-oriented parts of the community could input on that website. So the outreach campaign was kind of advertising the website. So there were television adverts saying, you know, if you're interested in science and these topics, come and look at this website and tell us what you think. They also did some outreach in schools, and one of the things they said afterwards is they would have liked to have done more outreach in schools and got more from the younger generation. Once they had all the ideas in on the website, they then had a peak panel, what they called a peak panel of scientific experts who sort of distilled all the inputs and identified what they called national science challenges. And these went into the research agenda, the research strategy for that 10-year period. I think a lot of this was actually about public buy-in and public understanding, and that's the way they sort of promoted it. It was a campaign to engage the public in what the thinking is on science. The extent to which the actual scientific priorities in the end were hugely influenced by members of the public, it wasn't really clear, and we questioned about this, and it wasn't really clear. I think there was some influence, but certainly it wasn't an agenda that was set by the public. It was sort of a predetermined priorities, and at the end, the experts came back in and refined them, but there was some public input in the middle to shape those priorities, and certainly there was public buy-in to the final strategy, which a lot of this was actually about public trust in science. They mentioned trust specifically as one of the things they wanted to promote here. So then moving to a very different case. So this was much more local in Colombia. So here they wanted scientific experts to engage on social challenges at a community level. So the focus was on vulnerable communities and engaging the local actors in those communities, heads of the communities, or NGOs, organizations linked to those communities. This was led by the Colombian Science Innovation Agency. So again, it's linked with the government, but it's a more specific sort of innovation agency rather than the previous one, which was a full government department. Again, they had initial broad priorities that were defined at the government level, but those priorities, there was some consultation around those with research institutions and with sponsors of the eventual program. They then took those priorities to the vulnerable communities and said, so in terms of water, what are your real challenges? Or in terms of energy, how does it work for you? What are your real challenges? And what can we do to address those? And they worked with the community to develop those challenges. And then they had a process where they really co-designed proposals and co-produced the knowledge at the end. So this was stakeholders working with researchers to develop solutions. So that's the Colombian example. The example from Japan, RISTEX, was similar in many ways. So again, it was really about coming up with solutions to local problems. The process was slightly different. In terms of the background, this grew out of the World Conference of Science, and actually that's the most significant thing at that World Conference on Science was a call for a new contract between science and society. So it was very much influenced by that. And they wanted to promote closer collaboration between researchers and the public. RISTEX is actually, it's part of the Japanese Science and Technology Agency. So this is actually a big program, research program within a science funding agency, but it's by no means all that that agency does. They used a lot of literature searching, text mining, online surveys of not just of scientists, but of other stakeholders, civil society stakeholders, to define their initial priorities. So what were the initial social challenges that should be addressed? They had interviews and workshops with experts to further define those in terms of what could be done in terms of R&D, so to focus down from the bigger priorities to come to a more specific R&D focus areas. And then they had a call for projects around those areas, and the research had to be transdisciplinary, so involving natural and social sciences and other stakeholders. And they actively managed the projects that were funded. So there was someone from the agency who was involved, overseeing the project very actively. Interestingly as well, then at the end of the project, they had what they call an implementation support program, where they provided additional funding to encourage the use and adoption of the outcomes more broadly than the local situation where the project had been carried out. So that's the Japanese example. The Korean example, I suppose, is somewhere between the two. So here, broadly speaking, what they wanted to do was, rather than just researchers deciding all the time what they should do, they wanted to include other civil society stakeholders in suggesting and addressing research issues. So they built an online platform which was interactive. So this, again, a little bit like the New Zealand project. They built this online platform, but it was different in the platform itself was interactive. So people could suggest ideas and questions, and other people could come in on those and suggest on top of that, and experts could also input. And so there was some discussion through the platform. And if you like, the ideas were incubated to some extent via that platform. Through that platform, they ended up with problems, issues, and they were then triaged by an expert steering committee. So the steering committee was not just scientists, it was also other stakeholders, but they call them experts. So people who were familiar with research, not just, if you like, the average lay person. And then they, having defined these problems, they then matched them to research teams. So they had a call for proposals around these problems, and they selected research teams to address the problems. So they had fairly defined problems at the outset, and that were to be addressed by the researchers. They had a few guiding principles that I think were important. So all participants should in some way be rewarded or incentivized or recognized. All content should be transparent and open. And this was important, and we'll come back to this at the end. In fact, throughout all the cases, this issue of transparency and openness was important. And they wanted to be able to scale up from these problems. Eventually, they wanted to be able to scale up to ideally a national level, but certainly other areas where they had similar problems. Finally, the Dutch National Research Agenda. So we didn't actually do this, we didn't do a case study of this in the same way. There's a lot being published about this, and this was also presented at an earlier meeting at OECD, and we talked to the people involved in it, but we didn't do exactly the same detailed interview, etc. But this is perhaps the best known of the recent, certainly national efforts to do open research agenda setting. So here they wanted real public input. They wanted really to influence on the agenda that they came up with. And they also wanted buy-in, so ownership of that agenda. In fact, at the end, one of the things that the people involved in this said was it gave a lot of political legitimacy to the scientific agenda. So when they went to Parliament for funding and presented the agenda, the fact that they had done this public engagement exercise actually really rung a bell with the parliamentarians. So one pillar of this agenda setting was the public consultation. So it was kind of ask a scientist a question. They got 12,000 questions submitted. And then they used various online tools, text mining, to cluster the research questions. They came up with around 250 clusters in the first instance. They then had conferences, discussion groups, expert panels, and they narrowed that down to 140 questions. There were hundreds of people involved in those conferences and expert panels, etc. They then took those questions and they matched them to the research organisations, the funders, the sponsors that already existed in the Dutch system. And they also mapped them onto the H2020, Horizon 2020 scientific agenda. And the digital tool that they used, the original Ask a Question tool, they were able to adapt that to link the original questioners, so the people behind these 140 questions could then link with the research organisations and or the researchers who were taking forward the questions. And in fact, my understanding is that at least half of the original questioners actually had interactions with the research organisations and the researchers. So here the guiding principles were science for science, science for society, and science for competitiveness. So there were those three drivers, if you like: societal engagement, better science, and also science and innovation. So pulling all of these together, we did an analysis of what are the sort of generic issues that come through. So the first of these actually will be quite obvious and intuitive, but interestingly are not always addressed. So in these exercises, it's important to keep the design as simple as possible and the questions as simple as possible. And it's important to actually engage the citizens on a level footing. So you don't have the experts here and the citizens there and use expert language that citizens will never understand. And you have to some extent broker what might come from citizens, translate it into scientific language. But it's important to really think of everyone being equal in participating. The methodology you use needs to match the aims. I think Lars could say much more about this than I can. So if you've already got your priorities defined and what you really want is just buy-in from the public, then that's quite a different process to saying we really want the public to set our agenda, to really influence the agenda, and you need to adapt your process accordingly. it's important to manage expectations on both sides. So experts, obviously, we need to learn how to engage with non-experts and the limitations about that, and vice versa. And issues like the public don't necessarily understand how long it might take to address some of the questions that they put forward. So they may want an immediate response, and it has to be clear that, you know, these things take time. Research takes time. So there's also some education about the research process and how it works involved in these exercises. Issues of transparency and trust are critical and came through in all the case studies. It's important to involve citizens at all stages as far as possible, and be clear about the decisions made and feedback to citizens what happened to their input as openly as possible. Don't just take all the questions, run away with them and never give any feedback. Interestingly, it's clear that completely new ideas can emerge from these exercises. So at the workshop in Korea, there was actually a discussion about space research, which might be an area where you think citizens would have nothing to say on this very specialized research agenda. The Koreans reported that actually citizens came up with some really out-of-the-box ideas that are now being taken forward in research projects, but wouldn't have arisen spontaneously from the research community. So even in areas where you think citizens might not have much knowledge because they're too expert, they're too defined, citizens actually can contribute. More routinely, what comes from these sort of consultations can really change the directions of research that is being done. And I'm sure that James Lind will talk about this afterwards, but for example, in the New Zealand project, it became clear that the citizens actually wanted more research on health services research, so things like care in the community, than classical clinical research. How do we cure this rare disease? And that actually changed the thinking for the medical research agenda. Digital tools, so these online tools, online consultations are great. They help us to reach a larger community. They can help with triaging. We can use, you know, AI to analyze the inputs that we get, can mine lots of information. But you also need personal interaction. It's critical, everyone said in all of these cases, that they also needed workshops or panels of mixed panels to also get that personal three-dimensional input to the priority setting. And so most use a mix of online tools and surveys and workshops, etc. And in terms of impact, at the start of this study, we were hoping to be able to look at the cases and look at their impact. In fact, none of these studies has really looked at outcomes, at impact. You can look at the agenda, perhaps, and say, we can clearly see how this has been influenced, but at the end impact, does it mean better research? How many solutions did it lead to, etc.? That has not really been done, and in fact the methodology for assessing the impact of these is also not there. So I'll finish there. These are two reports. One is specific to open research agenda settings, so describes these case studies, and then there's another report I'll highlight here, which is more a framework for open science that also talks about different parts of the research process and different actors and where citizens can be engaged. You can get these you can download these from the OECD website. Okay, I'll finish there.
Great, Carthage. Thanks. There are many messages in your report and in your presentation. I think just to give a little idea of what I think is important for seen from an HPP point of view here, from what you say and what we have discussed earlier. I think what the overview of the practices means that it's very important not to have a one-size-fits-all methodology for this. It's actually important that we begin to build up an actual methodology, so that we have several tools we choose and develop on, that we can begin to play along with and learn how they fit each other and when they're used and what. I also think that one of the things which has to do with your point about impact, it seems to me that it was interesting with the two programs where they actually invested in concrete follow-up with funds and also with demands to the researchers. I think that is very, very interesting. It's not just an exercise you do for fun. It actually means something for the money put into research and the way you build teams around research. I think those are some of the things I think are really important. How do we start the thing, methodologies, and having a methodology, and how do we end the thing, creating the impact in a structured way. I think that's at least one of the two things. Two of the things I take home for what we should say to the HPP.